This is not, I would say, common knowledge at this point, but it's something that we're really trying to explain because we feel like it will very much help unite the country, very much help us all kind of like see clearly as to what the real problems are here. The United States, we tried to get away from the British Empire, right, away from the crown, and they ended up capturing us back almost immediately, right? So we did in 1776, we had our Declaration of Independence. The first step towards kind of going off the rails there was in 1783, I want to say. They made this treaty that said for all of the British oligarchs in the United States, the ones that held the rights from the original like Virginia Company and the Plymouth Company, right? So these vast rights to land and resources, they said in this treaty that they would respect all of the rights and the debts owed to the British citizens that were still living here, right, including those British oligarchs. So there was a lot of ruckus about this at the time. A lot of people writing George Washington pretty upset about this. So already things were kind of starting to get sideways. We had established this national bank, first national bank of the United States. It was done by this Hamilton guy who was agent working on behalf of the Rothschilds. So essentially, they created this bank, and over time, the National Bank of the United States got bought up by these straw buyers, by these British banking oligarchs. And so in 1811, they let the charter expire, and that was a big part of the reason, that and the original titles of nobility. That was one of the big reasons for the War of 1812. So the original titles of nobility, the original 13th Amendment, was this thing that said any agent, direct or indirect, anyone who has any sort of title of nobility, like is working for the crown, directly or indirectly, you are not allowed to participate in our government, right? So that would essentially exclude all lawyers, and that would exclude a lot of these banking oligarchs that worked on behalf of the British Empire to try to boss hog us. And so when the British came, they burned the original titles of nobility, and they, were trying to kind of choke us in on New Orleans. They were trying to pin us to that coast, right? They didn't want us to be able to expand anymore. And so Andrew Jackson, he made his name kind of opposing the British Empire. So he wasn't the president at the time. They ended up doing a second bank of the United States. And that bank also ended up getting bought up by straw buyers on behalf of the Rothschilds, which is like the premier British Empire banking oligarch that worked on behalf of the crown, where it was like 80% owned by agents of the crown by the 1830s. So when Andrew Jackson came in, he dissolved that second bank, right? Because he was like, "Get out! We're not doing this." He kind of, that was his primary focus, was this existential battle they had with the British Empire, and so they dissolved that bank, and a lot of the banking oligarchs that were over here, like the big wealthy families, they conspired and ended up doing these dirty tricks to crash our economy. So over the next like 70 years, throughout the 1800s, there was, I want to say, 9 or 10 economic crashes that were direct setups by some of these empire banking oligarchs. And so we, despite all the nonsense with the banking, we're still trying to, push west. We were still trying to build up our industry. We were still trying to get away from the British Empire. And the British Empire had their foothold primarily, they did the banking in the north, and they had the slave and cotton trade in the south. And the slave and cotton thing was a huge stop on the East India Company, which was the British Empire's kind of paramilitary super corporation force. They were a major stop on that. So if we would have gotten rid of slavery, if we would have done more to be pushing them out, that would have essentially caused a ruckus throughout their whole supply chain all around the world. And so when colonies are getting out of hand, not just here, but throughout history and elsewhere with the British Empire, they start these revolutions and they try to break these bigger countries into smaller ones. And a good example of this more recently would be in Sudan. So Sudan used to be one country, and it was run by this guy, Omar al-Bashir. He wasn't playing ball with what the Western intelligence services wanted him to do. So they went and they stood up this rebel force in the south, and they broke off the southern part of Sudan, the oil-rich part of Sudan, into another country, right? So I call it chopped and screwed, but that's what they tried to do here with Civil War. They were secretly arming the Confederates, giving them intelligence, giving them money. The Confederate intelligence services operated like we're headquartered in London, right? That's something that nobody ever talks about.
Hmm.
And so after the war, when Lincoln wanted to bring the South back, right, he recognized that obviously, like these guys, what they did was really bad and got a lot of people killed. But if we split into two countries at this point, then that's an empire victory over here. So he was trying to bring them back as if they never left. And a few days later, he gets a bullet in his head by a guy named John Wilkes Booth. And John Wilkes Booth, another thing that is almost never talked about, was a guy that was essentially hired and trained by agents of the British Empire. And anybody can go on Wikipedia and look this up. The guys' names are John Surratt and George Sanders. And they worked for the Confederate Intelligence Services in London, and they worked for the Hudson Bay Company, which was like the East India Company that ruled over Canada, right? And immediately after, these known architects of the plot to assassinate Abraham Lincoln fled to London to safety afterwards, right? So after causing the Civil War, they assassinate our president. We go for a little bit more time, and there's another president called James Garfield, right? And he was assassinated by seemingly just some crazy guy. But this crazy guy was a part of one of those kind of like Keith Raniere, Jeffrey Epstein sort of like weird sex cults that the intelligence services get crazy people and weaponize them out of and pay them. So we had two presidents in the 1800s assassinated by the British Empire. Like that's something that's not often talked about. And also in the late 1800s, in the chaos of the post-Civil War situation, right, where they were strong-arming a lot of various things through into law, they did the Second Organic Act, which they essentially carbon copied the city of London into the United States, and we created the city-state called Washington, D.C. And for those who don't know, the city of London is another separate city-state. It's a small medieval enclave within the actual city of London. And it's an area where the same rules, like the normal rules of Parliament, don't apply to them. So the Central Bank of England is headquartered in the city of London, and the International Bar. Like, so the people that certify all the lawyers, and the American Bar, like what certifies our lawyers, they were a franchise of this thing called the International Bar, which is in the city of London, which is essentially like this lawless city-state jurisdiction within the regular city of London. And it's also like where most of the world's offshore, like illegal banking is directly backstopped by the Bank of England because they're in the City of London jurisdiction. So they have these medieval grandfathered-in laws where they could say, okay, you could be in some sketch country like Barbados, for example, and Barbados, their sketchy banks, the reason rich people feel comfortable putting their money there is because those banks, according to these medieval laws, can be backstopped by the Central Bank of England, meaning if they go under that, the Central Bank of England will cover you, right? So this city of London, lawless city-state within a country sort of a deal, was carbon copied into the United States here in the form of D.C., and D.C. is not a state, and it's one of the reasons why they don't have to follow the Constitution as the supreme law of law in the same way as they would as if they were a state.
But
right?
there's the banking in the Bank of England, as well as their almost replicated, controlled version is the Federal Reserve here in the United States, that private entity that's not federal, correct? They created it and controlled it.
So this DC happens in the late 1870s. They get a choke point over our legal system, right? And they assassinate several presidents who get in their way, including after Lincoln, after Garfield, this other guy named McKinley. So McKinley was very much in favor of the gold standard. He was very opposed to the creation of a Fed. And so he also wanted to create a rail network that went from Russia through Siberia all the way down where you could get from Europe to the southern tip of South America by rail. And for everybody to know, Britain was a primarily maritime power, right? All of their power militarily and economically came from the sea. And by controlling the seas, anyone who did business anywhere had to essentially go through them, pay them their cuts. And so this was a massive attempt to circumvent that and to develop trade that didn't go through the British Empire and to keep them from controlling our money. And sure enough, McKinley gets assassinated by a member of the Emma Goldman anarchist networks. So the British Empire for a long time, and they helped teach the CIA this too, of using criminals and terrorists as assets to like carry out assassinations on their behalf. So these Emma Goldman anarchist networks also run out of London. And they killed several, I want to say they killed 6 presidents, like 3 monarchs. They went on a complete tear at the beginning of the 19th century, but they kill McKinley, and in his place comes Teddy Roosevelt. And Teddy Roosevelt was, even if you look at all the pictures, he was obsessed with the British Empire. He had an uncle his uncle was the head of the Confederate Intelligence Service in London, and his big dream was, we want to create an Anglo-American naval empire, right? So he shuts down the railroad project and he starts doing the Panama Canal, and he essentially set the stage for the Federal Reserve to be happening. And then when he had termed out, right, he couldn't run anymore, he created this thing called the Bull Moose Party, right? Because the Republicans at the time, they did not want to go to World War I. They did not want to start a Federal Reserve. And so Teddy Roosevelt, being the traitor British agent that he was, he comes in, he starts this thing called the Bull Moose Party, and essentially splits the Republican Party in half so that Woodrow Wilson can walk in there and take the presidency. And Woodrow Wilson works with these preeminent empire banking oligarchs like Jacob Schiff, like Paul Warburg, and like J.P. Morgan, and like the Rockefellers. So a lot of people look at J.P. Morgan, for example, as an American oligarch. But J.P. Morgan's company, when it was first started, was called Peabody and Company, and was run by a British banking oligarch headquartered in London. And when that guy got old and let them take over the reins, he changed its name to J.P. Morgan. But essentially, J.P. Morgan was put on the map by Rothschild money and never stopped carrying the empire's water for his entire life, right? So all these guys, Schiff and Warburg, they were, during the end of World War I, they were working on behalf of the British Empire, and they were who funded the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. So the reason that Russia became communist is because these British bankers who lived in America were funding the Bolsheviks and funding Lenin and funding the assassination of the King of Russia, right? So a lot of this stuff comes from the same source. Woodrow Wilson, he lets the Fed go through, right? So they essentially capture control of our currency, do it in the image of the Central Bank of England, and then they get us into World War I. Even though, like, from an American standpoint, like, what possible interest did we have in World War I? And this picture on the screen right here, this is another anarchist, a British asset anarchist that assassinated the Archduke that popped off the war in the first place. And this is how sneaky. When I was talking about the hooky spooky symbols, this is the license plate of the car that guy was assassinated in. And on the front, it says A111118. And Armistice Day, like this, the reason that we all say, 11/11, make a wish, that comes from Armistice Day, which is the end of World War I, right? And Armistice Day magically ended up falling on the 11th day of the 11th month at the 11th hour, right? It was this whole thing of magically God allowed us to finally end this BS war on this day.
How did you discover
that? It was written on the license plate of the car he was shot in.
How did you discover that?
I got an eye for the hooky spooky symbolism, right?
Yes.
Obviously they are masterful at it, and they almost can't help themselves, right? Because if you're in covert operations, you're behind the scenes, and you're constantly trying to like throw your little winks in there, and that was a hell of a wink that they threw in there. But the anarchist that assassinated the Archduke, and I have a whole video about this on my site, was coordinated through another British banking oligarch called Cecil Rhodes. And so it was the British Empire, and you can watch the video on our site. It's kind of a long-winded explanation, but they essentially wanted to set up this war to degrade and destroy a lot of their enemies that were industrializing, and we're going to give them lots of competition into the future. And after the war, Germany was destroyed. They pretty much had this unconditional surrender, and so these same British oligarchs came in there, looted Germany, right? Essentially captured the political system, the economic system, everything else like that, and created the conditions intentionally to set up World War II, right? And the reason they needed World War II, or one of the reasons, was that after World War One, a lot of people knew, like, hey, this war was BS, right? There was the King of England fighting his cousin, who was the King of Germany, and his other cousin, which was the King of Russia. Like, this is all a total racket, right? A total, uh, completely on the crown, like an inter-crown family dispute, and that we, millions of us died for, right? So nobody that was fighting in that war felt like, this is a righteous victory here. And so for that reason, and for a bunch of other reasons, including technological advancement and like trying to draw the United States in even more and trying to, position themselves as the good guys, the Secret Intelligence Service, they stood up Hitler. They helped Hitler get into power. They created the crushing economic conditions by which Hitler's rhetoric was extremely electric. And here's the other thing, is that Germany was supposed to deindustrialize according to the terms after World War One, but mysteriously, under the care of all these British banking oligarchs that were looting them, Germany goes into World War II with a 6.5 million man army, like professional army. The United States, for example, only had 500,000 at the time. And they have some of the sweetest equipment, right? The best tanks, the best planes, the best guns, the best everything, right? So for this military / oligarchic administration of Germany, right, that the British went in and did, they sure did set up the conditions for Germany to be quite potent. And then they engineered this drug addict and this essentially psycho named Adolf Hitler into power there. And this is one of the things, a lot of people look at me weird when I say this, but if you look at the conditions of after World War One, if you look at kind of all the stuff that was moving and shaking in Germany, like, there is no way Germany could have come back after losing like half of their male-age population, after getting completely looted, after their currency completely crashing, and been this powerful without some fingers on, like, pulling the strings behind the scenes.
Yeah, and Prescott Bush financing.
Yep. So Prescott Bush, I believe, worked for the Harrimans, which is another one of those preeminent British banking oligarchs from the 1800s. But yeah, it's all one big British club, and we just have not been aware of it, right? So Franklin Delano Roosevelt, right? He was essentially putting the United States in a position to be going to war, right? If you read the detailed, and even not even on like conspiracy stuff, you just read the details of his presidency, of the granular like setup for that. He was seemingly preparing to go to war like years and years before they actually ended up pulling the trigger and going to war. And they were talking openly behind the scenes how the Americans would never be down to go to war unless there was some kind of major attack. There was also a lot of intelligence. Like, the United States government definitely knew before Pearl Harbor that we were about to be attacked. 100%.
Mm-hmm.
And Pearl Harbor was almost a mirror image of a similar attack that was done by the Japanese Empire on Russia, right? So Japan had a precedent for doing this, using the funding and the weapons given to them by Jacob Schiff and Paul Warburg, right?
Yeah.
These empire banking oligarchs. So FDR, his grandpa, like, he was a super rich, I would say Trump sort of rich, sort of a president, right? His mom was best friends with the Queen of England. His grandfather, the reason they got rich in the first place, was his grandfather ran the leg of the East India Company where they would ship heroin from India to China, right? So his grandpa got rich forcing people to buy heroin for the East India Company. That's what Franklin Delano Roosevelt came from. So during World War II, the CIA came up and pretty much stood up the OSS by MI6. They came over here and they said, hey, do exactly this, hire exactly these people, operate exactly this way, so on and so forth. And that was kind of entrenched after the war when the when the OSS got reformed into CIA. And so for a long time, between these think tanks, between these banking institutions, between this legal system, and after World War II with the intelligence services, we have been completely captured by the British Empire. And one of the things I talk about, one of the things that I think was the huge thing that ultimately landed me in prison, was I talk about this entity called D6. D6 is the covert paramilitary wing of the CIA and of MI6. And so with things like the East India Company, right? The British Empire had this massive force, this paramilitary force that was twice the size of its regular army, that was completely off the books and not subject to laws of, normal British laws, right? So, in the same way that the East India Company is completely an entity completely off the books, D6 is this self-funded, and it's funded through drug dealing, human trafficking, extortion, all this stuff. And it's this completely parallel entity outside of the CIA that only a few of them know about that actually does the nastiest stuff on their behalf. And so when nobody, as far as I'm aware, nobody before me has ever came out and said D6 publicly and lived to tell
Is
the
that
tale.
true? Really?
And yeah, so this D6 thing is absolutely insane. This is the people, you want to kill people, you want to rig elections, you want to bribe and blackmail people worldwide. This apparatus that the CIA took over, right, was the secret intelligence apparatus of the British Empire, right? And they realized, hey, this is getting really expensive, right? We're getting really unpopular around the world. So they transferred a lot of this stuff into the CIA and started getting us to carry their water for them. And if you look at all the places where we go to war now, if you look at Iraq, in Libya, in parts of Africa, right? If you overlay a map of the British Empire and the spaces that they were fighting for, almost all of them directly align with what the CIA is now telling us to go to war with right now.
Mm-hmm.
Not just the Atlantic Council and CFR, but Bilderberg, right? Is another one of these secretive groups that they feel like they're deciding what the agenda is here.
What's best for
Bilderberg
us?
was started in the Netherlands by the cousins, like the royals that run the Netherlands. That is the royals that run the UK. Like Queen Elizabeth's cousin is who ran the Netherlands, right? So this royal family that controls all the main spaces in Europe, right? The EU's in Belgium. Belgium is run by a king who's cousins with King Charles. The International Criminal Court is run out of the Netherlands, and this Bilderberg thing is run out of the Netherlands, run by a king who's cousins with the British king, right? So it's this very sneaky thing that this crown is still exerting all this undue influence over us. And people say, they're like, oh, you really think, that the CIA controls, or that the MI6 and the crown controls the CIA? And it's like, yes, I do. I think that the CIA at this point is like the muscle, right? The body, the arms, the feet, the muscle of the secret intelligence apparatus. And MI6 is the brain, right? That tells it where to go. And even going back to this, like this war in Ukraine, right? So we never really had beef with Russia, right? Until after World War II, when we had this moron Truman get in there, who's being handled, and like threaten them with nukes. This long-standing beef with Russia was never our beef. This is essentially a royal beef that we inherited from the British Empire, and essentially got tricked into carrying this water on their behalf.
What about how he handled Russia? Is that what resulted in John F. Kennedy's assassination?
Yep. So he wanted to get rid of the CIA. He knew that it was completely compromised. He wanted to expose how Abraham Lincoln and some of these other presidents, who they were really killed by. He wanted to cut this out with this Cold War nonsense with Russia. He wanted to find a way to be amicable with them, right? We didn't have to be best friends, but we don't have to be like on the brink of nuclear war every second, right? And he was actually going around. They have this speech. It was the speech, the press one, right, where he says he's starting to lay the groundwork to essentially expose this D6 thing, right? And he says there's this ruthless and monolithic conspiracy, and it encompasses like every aspect, scientific, military, diplomatic, all these various things, and how they operate with infiltrators by night instead of armies by day, and how they control everything and they kill anyone who gets in their way. So he started making this speech, and a lot of people think that he was talking about either the CIA or something else on that. But if he says a ruthless and monolithic entity, at the time the CIA was only 20 years old, right? So the CIA was hardly monolithic at the time. And he was talking about this monolithic conspiracy of the British Empire of using drug dealers and criminals and terrorists as assassins, which went all the way back to the days of the Pirates of the Caribbean, right? So in the 1500s, Spain had this massive armada. They were going and getting all the colonies in the Americas and getting tons of gold out of it. Britain, they wanted their cut, but they weren't big and bad enough to mess with Spain. So they went and they got non like black flag ships, right? With theoretically, independent operators over there, to go attack those ships and to loot them on behalf of the British Empire. A lot of the most famous pirates in history were actually directly reporting to the crown there. So this was a trade that they engineered back in the day. And when those pirates didn't have Spanish ships to attack, they made these colonies that were funded by opium, aka heroin trafficking, and sex slavery, right? So that's how they kept those guys fed when there weren't ships to attack, was through this ruthless and monolithic conspiracy. So JFK was about to blow the whistle on this. I think the normal threats that you'd get towards him, they're probably like, oh yeah, we're going to expose that you were, messing around on your wife. And he's like, I don't care. Like I'm a pimp. And they're like, oh, we're going to kill you. And then he was like, you think I'm scared of these death threats, dude? I drove a boat up on the beach to D-Day, right? I got severely wounded. You think you're going to scare me with these little hooky spooky threats? Like, get out of here. So they had to find a way to get rid of him. And so there's the CIA, MI6, the Mafia joint operation. And one of the things about if MI6 is involved in something, and the CIA still uses this very day, if they go get the crown to order something, they say, okay, it's a threat to British interests, the CIA helps them carry that out. Now, since it was ordered by one of these royals, based on the royal legal authorities, it can be kept secret forever. So they could do anything and it's not illegal if you're a royal. And you can keep things secret forever. Those are two hard set legal principles there. And it's one of the reasons why this monarchy is the glue that holds the deep state together. A lot of the illegal things they do, they would not be able to keep secret. They would not be able to keep getting away from it unless they have this royal authority to fall back on, right? So this thing, a lot of people are like, oh, who cares about what the crown is doing? It's like the crown is the glue that holds this deep state together.
Is there, first of all, this is continued on, I believe, with the assassination of John F. Kennedy. The regime that's in place right now came to power that we're seeing right now, that we're suffering through. From Reagan, Bush, Bush 1, Clinton, Bush Jr., Obama, and now Biden is just one big conglomeration of all of them.
Well, if you think about it, so they got their way, right? So they kill Kennedy.
Mm-hmm.
They get Johnson in there, he's going to be super corrupt, do whatever they want. And then Nixon comes in, tries to rein in that war, and tries to be more for the people there. And they railroad him out of town. And then Ford, the guy who was literally their cover-up guy of the Warren Commission, gets in there, right? And then Carter and Reagan, we finally get a decent guy with Reagan. But if you remember, Reagan, in his very first year, takes a bullet, right? So he clearly wasn't playing ball, and he took a bullet for that. And after that, right, Reagan was a great guy. I actually think there's a lot of parallels between Reagan and Trump because he was a good guy with some good ideas, right? A lovable personality, but he had an administration that was just absolutely running wild on him, right? And it was pretty much impossible for him to rein those things in. And I think that had a lot to do with the fact that he took a bullet. And then we get Bush Sr., the CIA director / British agent that works for the British banking oligarchs. And we get Clinton, who he was not just the governor that oversaw the Iran-Contra, like the arms for the drugs sort of a deal, right, where they were selling cocaine and buying weapons and then setting the weapons down there and then bringing more cocaine. It was one of those self-funded D6 programs. Bill Clinton was also an arms dealer himself.
Was he really?
So, yeah, actually, I don't want to say who, but one of the people we've talked about earlier in this interview that is part of some of the projects we've been working on has personal firsthand experience with that. I don't want to necessarily dox him on here in case he doesn't want to talk about that publicly, but Bill Clinton was a big arms dealer, right? And they were working on behalf of the CIA. And they, with that Whitewater stuff where all those records burned down, right? They realized early on that if we get our dirt and our corruption mixed in with the CIA stuff, then they will move heaven and earth to protect us and to make sure that this never sees the light of day. So we just kept getting, after Kennedy, it was kind of a downhill. We had a glimmer of light with the Reagan guy, but then he takes a bullet, right? And now his administration is just running wild on him too. So we have had pretty much nonstop bad presidents working for the other team here for 60 years.
A long time. And things, I believe, are coming to a head. I'm looking at the chat rooms. People are blown away by this. Blown away. The amount of information that just flowed in this first segment